Grand City is where millions of people call home. So when anyone or anything becomes a threat, it's my job to help. Sure, I've got my stories like any other hero. Saving the day, fighting the bad guy, but I've never had to be on a team. No one else is coming to rescue them. This is all on me. I am the Guardian of Grand City.
Hey everybody, I'm CJ, and came across this it's sort of an interesting article on Games Radar / Newsarama. It basically talks about the Marvel DC Comics rivalry, and basically how there is no rivalry anymore. The rivalry, such as it was, is over, and it outlines a kind of a long series of factors that contributed to the demise of the Marvel and DC rivalry. But I mean, the basic thesis of this, it does seem to mostly be true. I think there are some factors here that I'm gonna talk about, but I think these factors are kind of getting ignored a little bit. One of which is the rise of kind of hand-wringing, simpering, conflict-averse beta generation, the Zoomers. I don't know what it is about these dang kids today, but it's like they come from this world where everybody has to be affirmed no matter what they do, what they believe in, what they say, what they think, what they want, what they do. It's fucked up. But I mean, there are examples of this, of just this kind of false ecumenical, just fucking bullshit. Yeah, and you do see it around. You see it on Twitter, pretty often. I'm not even going to play this guy's TikTok, but basically it's this Sub-Zero take, basically saying, what if I told you that you can love both Marvel and DC? There's never been a better time to be a comic book blah, 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 blah. And I get it. I mean, we're basically raising an entire generation, or what am I saying? Have raised an entire generation of this guy. Everybody is cool, everything is good, and it's just... How somebody who is a Zoomer can stand being a Zoomer is actually kind of beyond me in a lot of ways. Like, I couldn't do it. I mean, I came up in a time when, I don't mind admitting, I was DC born and DC bred. When I die, DC dead. I would have these sort of weekend warrior sort of blowouts in the Marvel universe once in a while, but at the end of the day, DC Comics was always home for me. And I think that's kind of borne out in my actual collection, which is, it's probably, I would say probably half DC, maybe 25%, 25 to 30% Marvel. And then after that, everything else is just a sort of a hodgepodge of different independent publishers and whatnot. DC, at least for my collecting, was always top dog, the unchallenged top dog. But one of the things that you're going to become aware of growing up when I did was, primarily in the 90s, is the whole DC versus Marvel rivalry. And it is true that rivalry does seem to be dying out. And I can't blame all of it on the Zoomers like this guy, but I mean, let's not overlook the obvious. The article itself, it basically says, well, we live in a pretty tricky media environment these days where somebody can get canceled if they say something that's too edgy. Diamond distributors, they basically collapsed in on themselves in 2020. So DC and Marvel aren't competing anymore for promotional space and Diamond periodicals and whatnot. And basically, this article goes really fucking far out of its way to ignore the elephant in the room. Why is it that the DC Marvel rivalry has died? Why is it that DC and Marvel crossovers have died? There's actually a kind of an obvious explanation for that this article just doesn't even want to get. It just doesn't want to touch with a 10-foot pole. Specifically, there's really no difference anymore between DC and Marvel. Again, when I was a really little kid, like it basically I was born in like the last gasps of the pre-crisis on Infinite Earths era of DC, where basically DC was this kind of science fantasy sort of alternate universe that it may not even have the same laws of physics that we have in the real world. Characters are impossibly idealized morally, and not just physically, but morally too. There's just this clear-cut difference between right and wrong, good and evil in most cases. And that was sort of DC's brand identity in the marketplace, whereas Marvel ostensibly was the world outside your window, just with superheroes in it. And so they would have the actual real-world president, in a lot of cases, as the president of whatever, at the time of whatever Marvel comic book you're reading was published. I don't know if they would very often come right out and say President Jimmy Carter or something like that. But nevertheless, you get the idea that whoever the president is in the real world, that's the president in Marvel Comics, at least until recently. Marvel was basically like somewhat the real world. DC was more of a fantasy. And so at least when I was when I was first born, that was always the difference between the two of them. Now, post-crisis, we can say that the DC universe did get somewhat Marvelized. But even then, I mean, you still had DC characters whose adventures were taking place in fictional cities. And a lot of the characters, they didn't really have... They may have had flaws, but they didn't have a fatal flaw. And Marvel has always been defined by the fatal flaw of their characters. And so post-crisis, that was the identity of each company. And the thing is, none of those things apply anymore. Because like I say, there's really not a big difference anymore between Marvel and DC. They're basically the same now. With one company, you've got DC SJW. With the other company, you've got Marvel SJW. But there's really not a difference, not a substantive difference between the two companies anymore. What is there to have a rivalry about anymore? They're basically the same. I mean, the characters look kind of different. They dress kind of different. But it's the same basic SJW hive mind that's producing most of the comics for both companies. I mean, there's really nothing for fans to get competitive about anymore. They're telling more or less the same kinds of stories, and the characters are basically the same. Or I don't know if they're the same, but I would say they're broadly interchangeable with one another. There's really nothing to distinguish one company from the other anymore. They're pretty much the same, which, as we know, is the SJW agenda. I mean, that's what they want. They want their culture to be the only culture. So even if you've got, in theory, two different choices of media or consumer product or whatever else, it doesn't matter because they're created by the same types of people. You're supporting their ideology and doctrine no matter what you believe in or no matter what choice you make. And so for those reasons, it's only logical to think that, you know what? A logical casualty of this homogenization of comics is going to be the lack of a rivalry. I mean, I think the rivalry still exists among older fans because they remember what things were like in the before time. But for fans coming up now, I mean, what is there to make you see the other side as a rival? There's really nothing. Now, I speak here of comics. I think that it is a little bit different with movies. The movies based on DC characters and movies based on Marvel characters, they really do have different flavors from one another. There is something to have a rivalry about there, which I find in Mr. Zoomer's little tweet here. He makes sure to emphasize comic book movie, because God forbid anyone read a fucking comic anymore. And honestly, comics suck so bad anymore, I can't really blame the guy too much, but nevertheless, anyway, I'm rambling. The point is, the movies have qualities that can distinguish themselves from one another, and there is something to have a rivalry about there. But at least in terms of the comics, these characters' natural habitat, what is there to be competitive about anymore? What is there to have a rivalry about anymore? I mean, both companies suck just about equally, and for pretty much the same reasons. So does it really make sense to have little pissing contests with each other over which company is better? I mean, maybe the real debate is which company sucks more. So I don't know. Either way, though, I just find it kind of telling that this article really didn't want to get too close to any of that stuff. There have to be market forces at work, or it had to be the lockdown, or it had to be cancel culture or something like that. That's the reason that the rivalry doesn't exist anymore. No, I think the real reason the rivalry doesn't exist anymore is there's just, like I say, there's nothing to compete for anymore. So anyway, I just wanted to throw all that out there and just see what comes back to me. That's that. Thank you for watching. Subscribe, make sure you're still subscribed, comment, like, and share this video because it really helps me out. Also, you can find me on Twitter at Cole Loves Comics.